I'm gonna need, great. I'm gonna need to leave at 2:30 today. I've got an appointment this afternoon that I couldn't change, so I'll try to keep everything moving today. Thank you all for joining me. I feel compelled to go back to my buyer's notice because I still see a number of contracts coming in with waived inspections. So let me share that screen here to make sure we go over this. I won't spend too long because I'm pretty sure that everybody's seen this in prior weeks, but I really am trying to get the word out that Keller Williams strongly discourages buyers from waiving inspections. It seems like I see a lot of contracts that come through, and many of them are from other brokerages where they feel like putting 0 days or N/A or waiving inspections in the paragraphs of the contracts are okay. I'm very concerned as your broker for you, the agent, and for Keller Williams, that somebody would say, well, this place looks great, I don't need an inspection, or everything looks brand new, it's just remodeled, they don't need an inspection. So instead of investing $300 or $400, unfortunately, they end up closing, and now they've closed and find out 2 weeks later the air conditioner shut, or there were things wrong with it. There could be leaks. There could be lots of things that go wrong in a home, which could be defective conditions that the buyer could ask the seller to address before closing. But two things happen when you waive inspections. Number one, you lose your ability to go into the home until the walkthrough inspection. Most people don't think about that. They're like, well, I'll go back over and check it out myself, or I'll have my Uncle Fred, he's a contractor, go with me and we'll look it over. Unfortunately, you do not have the right when you waive inspections to enter the property until the walkthrough, which is the day of or day before closing. So that hampers you for a couple of reasons. Number one, you may not even be able to see your residence from the last showing you had, which could be days or weeks ahead of your contract being approved. And two, it's nearly impossible for you to determine one of the most important parts of the contract, which is the seller's maintenance obligation. The heart of all contracts are, we go to contract, the seller must maintain the property in the condition it was in when you agreed on a contract. Must. Doesn't matter whether it's an as-is contract, it's a FAR-bar contract, it's an ABOR contract, doesn't matter. All of these contracts have that provision in them. And if you have not seen the property since you last showed it, and you go in the day of closing or the day before, and it's very warm in there, I don't understand, well, maybe this had the air conditioner off. How do you know that the air conditioner didn't start to malfunction? You were there, it was nice and cool when you did your showing, and now all of a sudden it seems very warm and humid in the place. You can have a great deal of trouble trying to convince the seller that there's a problem when you don't have a baseline. You never inspected it, so you don't have a baseline. Say, well, it was warm in there. And the seller says, yeah, I know. I've been gone for a few days and I just turned it on for your walkthrough inspection. You really have, you lose a lot of leverage that you would otherwise have by doing a simple inspection and having a baseline and having somebody who's licensed to look at places and understand what might be wrong. So we asked if your buyer, after all that conversation, still says, I don't care, I'm not going to bother with the inspection. We ask that you have them sign this notice. And so now they move in and they find out, gee, the air conditioner was on its last legs. It hadn't been well maintained. We need to replace it. It's $12,000. What was the first person they're going to call? They're going to call Jeff Jones, their agent, and go, you sold us this place, we paid good money for it, now we have to replace the air conditioner. And what can you say as an agent? You say, well, we talked about having an inspection, you decided not to, so there's not a whole lot I can do for you. Oh yeah, well, I'm going to turn this all over to my attorney. I don't think I was treated fairly, and boom, there you have it. Now you as an agent and your company is in a lawsuit, rightfully or wrongfully. It just isn't worth it. So I'm requiring that if your buyer decides to, and you have the buyer decides to waive inspections, that you have them sign this statement before we will approve your DA for payment. Just too much risk, too much liability. And as hard as I try and I huff and I puff, some people just aren't getting it, or they're thinking that maybe I'm, too animated about this. The other part of the buyer's notice that we've added in there is if your buyer has lost a few contracts because they took a cash offer and not your financing offer, even though you were well qualified, seller took the cash offer. So now you go in and you say, hey, Mark, we've lost 3 offers. Let's go in cash on this. And Mark says, well, that's great, Jeff. I mean, I'm happy to do that for you. It might strengthen your position. But let me just ask you one question. If you don't get your loan that you said you needed, and for some reason your lender can't close on the day that we're scheduled to close, and the seller won't give us an extension, do you have the money? I mean, do you have it somewhere in the market? Do you have it somewhere in a fund that you could raise the money at least till you got your loan done? Well, no, I'm sorry, Mark. I just don't have the money. I have to have this loan to buy this house. So we're going to want the buyer to say, okay, I'm willing to take this risk, but if I lose my deposit, I'm not going back to Mark and saying, hey, Mark, why didn't you tell me I'd lose my money if I couldn't close on time? So these are 2 things that are happening in our contract world, mostly out of people trying to make their offer look more substantial, and voila, liability ensues. And you really don't want a angry buyer who is unlikely to do business with you again, and you want to be responsible for trying to let the contract work for them, the contract being the inspection period and the seller's maintenance obligation. So I'm going to get off of that topic, but I like to try to keep at all the sales meetings and all my contract classes. I like to bring this awareness to you. So if you don't have a copy of this, I'll be glad to send it to you. We're trying to get it in the contract library. Haven't had a lot of luck with that, with DocuSign, but we're working on it. But in the meantime, have a conversation with your buyer who says, I don't really think I need to inspect. Have a conversation. Say, you know what? Our brokerage strongly recommends that you do an inspection. It's a small investment to find out if there are any defects that are not readily observable that probably the seller doesn't even know about. Okay. So let's go now into today's topic. And we do a class every probably 5 or 6 months where we compare the FAR/BAR and NABOR contract by its major areas. And there are 2 documents available to you. The first one is a summary document that is meant to be like something you might stick in your briefcase. And basically, we're going through all of the different facets of the contract, and we are comparing the really primarily the FAR/BAR and the NABOR. However, we do see an occasional Florida Realtors contract known as the Contract for Residential Sale and Purchase. It is published and maintained by the Florida Realtors, and we see it intermittently. It does have some good things to it, and most of the time we see it is when somebody goes into their contract library, thinks they're picking the FAR/BAR, and they get the CRISP, because if you go into most contract libraries, both of them are available. But we still see them, so we included that in the comparison. And just a companion document, which we won't use today, but there's a companion document which is called a detailed analysis. All right. This then compares the by line number and goes into specific language that backs up everything in your summary sheet. So if you're looking for inspections or defective conditions, and we summarize it in this little summary worksheet, you can always go here and get more detail and get the specific line numbers of the contracts that are referred to. So it's kind of a handy cross-reference, especially if you're working in a world where you work with both contracts. And it's available. We update it every time a contract changes. And we usually have a couple of lunch and learns at NABOR about this. So we will go to the back to the summary here. And I want to know if everybody can see that okay. Yes? Okay. So what I'd like to do here for the next few 45 minutes is just kind of go through the differences between the contracts, which are significant. And we start with time of the essence. Time of the essence means that if the events that are scheduled do not occur on the date that they're agreed upon, if they don't occur, like a closing or a deposit or an inspection period, then immediately the day after that, there is a party in default. So understand in the FAR and the CRISP contract that all dates are time of the essence. Whether you miss a date, when you miss a date, regardless of the reason, I'm just sending a text about the contract question. The effective date is day 0. There we go. So you really have to be very careful in the FAR and the CRISP contract to make sure you calendar your dates, make sure you advance them a little bit to give notice to your buyer or seller that there's a critical date coming due. And if you miss those dates, severe penalties can ensue. In the NABOR contract, the only date in the contract that is time of the essence is the closing date. So unless the parties agree to extend the closing date, or unless there's a you run across the part of the financing contingency where we have purely a lender delay, then the buyer can waive their contingency and extend the closing up to 10 days. Other than that, both parties have to agree to extend that closing date, or one or the other parties who didn't come to the table for whatever reason, their loan wasn't done, one of the other parties is in default. So the effective date is the date on which all parties agree, and it is the last signature or date that has an initial or a signature and a date. So as a best practice, you really want to have all of your changes to the contract. If it's a counter, or if it's a response to an offer, you want your initials and signatures to have dates on. It's the only way you can protect your customer, to make sure that the last agreement of the contract, which is the effective date, is agreed to by all parties. Now, I've seen people initial a counter and lose several days from the effective date, because remember, the effective date is the last date that it's the latest date that all parties have on the contract. So always date, whether you're initialing or whether you're signing, always have a date with it. That secures your position in the contract. Okay. The FAR and CRISP contracts, Florida Realtors contracts, all require that both parties initial at the bottom of each page. The NABOR contract absolutely positively does not require initials at the bottom of the page, although an agent might tell you that, or somebody might say, my broker says everything has to be initialed. It absolutely doesn't. Every time we go through a contract revision, we are asked to put those initials on the bottom of every page of the neighbor contract? And we say no, because our lawyers that are on that panel advise us that if you don't initial page 8 and there's a dispute among the parties, it could be ruled that the contract is not valid. So if you get a contract and it's all the pages are initialed in neighbor, you get a contract, your customers do not need to initial the pages. All right. So inspections obviously work night and day in these two contracts, and we've spent quite a bit of time on inspections in some past classes. But understand that in FAR bar and in CRISP, the inspection breaks down into 3 buckets. And in the standard FAR bar contract and CRISP contract, there's a bucket for repairs, a bucket for wood destroying organisms, and a bucket for permits. Those buckets cannot be mixed. So if they default to 1.5% of the contract price, and you've got a $300,000 contract, that's $4,500 that can go into each one of those buckets, or an amount that you put in that overrides that 1.5%. So for smaller contracts, that may not be much of a repair limit. And remember, in the FAR bar contract, the seller is obligated to repair up to the repair limit that you put in the contract. Defaults to 1.5%. If it's a $200,000 home, that's $3,000. That won't cover a major repair to an air conditioner or something like that, an appliance. So always look at that and always go over that with your buyer to make sure that enough money is being put into those buckets. So in the neighbor contract, there are no buckets. Buckets are gone. There's a 4-period time specified in the contracts, defaults to 15 days for inspection, 5 days to request repairs to the seller, 10 days for the seller to respond. And if the seller responds with a counter or does not agree to repair defective items, the buyer does have a 5-day window after receiving that response for the seller to cancel and get their money back. But again, all of these things are time periods that are important. And if you go beyond them, you give up some of your rights. So if you wait more than 5 days after the end of your inspection period, and usually in most of these contracts today, the inspection periods are being brought down to 10 days. I've seen 5, I've seen 3. I don't know how you do it 3, but they're not usually allowing, the seller's not usually allowing the buyer 15 days. So that's often a negotiating item. But after the end of your inspection period, you have 5 days to request repairs using the buyer's election and seller's response, or if you're on an as-is contract, using an amendment to the contract requesting for repairs. And then the seller has 10 days to respond under the normal contract. Obviously, under an as-is, if you send an amendment in, the seller has to respond by the end of your due diligence, or you can either cancel or accept the property the way it was. So be careful you calendar these things. The seller will not usually take 10 days to respond. And when the seller sends their response to you, you have 5 days from the date that you receive that response from the seller to say, no, I don't agree with your response and I'm going to cancel. Let me check that. So that's basically the difference in the three contracts there. The Florida Realtors contracts all use 3 repair buckets. Seller's obligated to repair up to that amount. Seller can do more on their own volition. But if you've got $3,000 in the repair bucket, and the repair bucket's $4,000, the seller will ask you which ones you want me to do, because I'm only going to do what I've agreed to in the contract. Where will this recording be placed for future reference? That's a good question. I believe you can get that stuff from our Facebook page. I believe they're cataloged there, but that's one that I'll be sure to answer for you. So let's talk about the heart of inspections is in all the contracts is what is deemed to be defective and what can the seller, what is the seller required to repair? So the essence of all inspection processes are the contracts define what it is that the seller needs to address in the case of a defective item. And there's very detailed descriptions in all of these contracts of what is defective and what the seller must address and what is cosmetic and the seller does not have to address, okay? And they vary by contract. For example, the FAR bar contract does not address radon. There is a new mold rider, which is kind of nebulous, but anyhow, there's a new rider that does allow the buyer to include a rider that has to do with elevated mold, where the buyer does have a chance to get out if the cost of the mold remediation exceeds a certain threshold. In the CRISP contract, radon is addressed, whereas radon is not addressed in the FAR bar contract. So if you have a radon test and it comes back over 4, there is no procedure really for the seller to make good on a positive radon test. So if radon is a problem, there's a simple sentence that you can add that comes right out of the FAR bar contract that says, if the radon levels exceed the federally approved permit levels, then the seller can remediate or the buyer can walk. And that sentence I'll be glad to give you if you want to put it into a FAR bar contract. It does bring excessive radon levels into question. So coming over to the NABOR contract, wood destroying organisms, radon, non-allergenic and toxic mold, wood rot, non-permanent structures, open permits. Remember that when it comes to open permits, remember that at the time, generally you go to contract and select a title company is when the title company will order what's called a municipal lien search, which will take a look at anything that's out there in the public record on the property, including permits. Sometimes these things take quite a while to do, but if you're in an as-is contract and you don't include any language in your as-is contract about the seller addressing open or expired permits or unpermitted structures, the seller has no obligation on an as-is contract to look at permits at all. And these can be big time. Some updates and enhancements can be done without a permit, and they needed a permit. And so now the buyer doesn't have any choice but inherit that condition. So really there's a lot of steps in these contracts that are there to protect the buyer. And when they're not protected, can be a real embarrassing situation when they come to you as the agent and say, why didn't you tell me about this? So make sure you have a heads up, make sure you know what's covered in each contract and what's considered effective. All right. Cosmetic conditions vary across the contract. Okay. But most of them are related to normal wear and tear, not affecting the working condition of a system or equipment. Cracked roof tiles, curling shingles, both contracts, NABOR and FAR bar contracts, have provisions for just normal wear and tear kinds of things. In the FAR bar contract, torn screens are considered defective. In the NABOR contract, torn screens are considered cosmetic. So know your contract. Again, if you go to the detail that I showed you for each one of these, and I'll be happy to share this summary and the details with you. It's a simple Excel spreadsheet. But basically what it is you're comparing each contract and knowing each contract. So when you get that report as a listing agent from the buyer saying, here's what I want, you have to know what's defective and you have to know what's cosmetic. And it's not unusual for a buyer to ask a seller to address a cosmetic item. Not unusual at all. So make sure you know that the difference, so that you can properly ask. If your buyer says, well, ask for everything, you say, well, that has some goods and bads. We ask for things that are known cosmetic. The seller's going to say, I'm not addressing those. And now all of a sudden, a smooth relationship can be torn a little bit by the fact that the seller's like, why are you asking me to address things that I don't need to address? Know these lines in the contract, review them with your buyer when they're submitting a request for repairs, and review them with your seller when we receive the request for repairs, to make sure we know what to address. And when the seller responds in an ABOR contract to the buyer's request and seller's response, the seller responds by checking box A, saying, I'm going to address everything that's defective. That limits the buyer's ability to cancel the contract. So make sure you know this, make sure you know how your seller is going to respond to these things. And this is just like a little summary showing you, overview what, if you had this little summary and you were looking at the contract and you had two different contracts, you can tell exactly where you stand on that. So in the as-is conditions, there is an as-is addendum to the NABOR contract and a NABOR as-is contract. In the FAR, there's a rider that adds the as-is provision, and there's a separate as-is contract. So I won't get up on my soapbox, but as-is contracts are not in the best interest of either the buyer or the seller. And most people don't understand the limitations of an as-is contract when it comes to repairs, permits, those sorts of things, obligations of the seller, which are pretty much waived by the as-is contract. So everybody loves the due diligence period. They love the ability to walk away, but they don't understand, either the seller or the buyer, that many of the provisions that are baked in with some detail into these other contracts are there to protect both parties and to have a standard by which repairs get made and to be able to go smoothly through the transaction. And an as is, you send an amendment over saying, hey, the air conditioner is rusty. I want a new air conditioner. Seller agrees to it, it's fine. But in many cases, the seller will go into an as-is contract thinking, oh, man, this is great. I won't have to make any repairs. And at least 8 times out of 10, maybe more, the buyer will come back and say, thank you very much. Either we agree on repairing these things or a credit or a reduction in the price, or we're walking away. Now the seller's had their house off the market for, I don't know, 7 days, 10 days, 15 days, and they find out that the buyer's making some rather unusual requests for a huge price reduction or credit, or a bunch of repairs that aren't really in the other contracts considered defective. Off the soapbox. The HOA disclosure is mandatory by the statute for any properties located in an HOA. How can I tell that? Generally, in the legal description, you might have the letters HO, but as long as it doesn't say condominium and it's in an association, a mandatory association, I think it's safe to assume that it's a homeowners association. So all the contracts basically require the HOA disclosure as a mandatory document. And should the listing agent or the buyer, if you're writing the contract, not provide that information to be signed off by all parties at the time of contract, basically the HOA statute triggers an automatic 3-day right of review for the buyer, and the buyer can cancel at any time in those 3 days. So if you're the listing agent you want to make sure that that HOA disclosure is uploaded with your documents and on the MLS listing, and that you request that the contract is not complete unless it has HOA disclosure signed by the buyer. That eliminates the effect of a buyer being able to say, well, I never got the HOA disclosure, and therefore I want to see the HOA docs. And oh, by the way, I can cancel. The FAR bar HOA disclosure they've added a second page to it. Please do not use the FAR bar HOA rider with the neighbor contract. The wording doesn't match up, and it's an ugly thing. But on the second page of the FAR bar HOA disclosure, there is a place to put other fees, such as transfer fees, capital contribution fees, golf fees, those kinds of things that apply to the HOA. The neighbor contract, it's strictly a paragraph that comes right out of the statute that says, these are the quarterly fees, these are any assessments, and these are any recreation fees. So please don't put a lot of things on the HOA disclosure for neighbor that aren't related to those three fields, because they don't mean anything, and they don't. Let's say you put $2,000 capital contribution fee on the HOA disclosure. It's not binding, doesn't mean anything, but people put it on there. Put on there what the statute requires is your best bet. So all of the three of the contracts have the ability to disclose the HOA, disclose the name, disclose the fees, and the neighbor one is a little bit more brief in that it only requires the fees that are obligated to be stated by the HOA statute. Condos, okay. The word condominium will likely be in the legal description of the residence if it's in a condo. And there are some older condos that this came in when they changed this law, probably back in the early 80s. So we're now getting to be years ago when there could be a property that didn't have the word condominium in the legal description. But generally, if you see the word condominium in the legal description, that's it. That's your trigger. Now, there may be a condominium located inside an HOA, so you might have both. But please do not ever submit an HOA disclosure for a condo. People just get so wrapped up, and I got to write it down somewhere. I got to write the quarterly fees down, so I'm going to write it on this HOA disclosure. No, it's a condo. That form is meaningless. The buyer is entitled to 7 types of documents and is entitled to a 3-day right of rescission once they receive all of those 7 documents. And in there is the financial statements, all of the financial information about the complex, the fees, any special assessments, those kinds of things. That's all contained in the information that is required to be provided to the buyer. Once they get all 7 of those documents, they have a 3 business day. It's one of the few business day periods in the contract. They have a 3 business day right of rescission. So what a lot of agents are now doing, especially if there's multiple offers, they're saying, hey, if we're going to select your offer, we want you to send us the condo document release so that we don't take your contract and then have you go 3 days later and say, oh, I'm exercising my right of rescission. Now I'm back to my multiple offers, showings, and that sort of thing. So you'll see it sometimes where the listing agent requires the condo disclosure. They upload all the docs with the condo, or with the listing, excuse me, and they say, sign this document receipt in advance so we know you do not have a 3-day right of rescission after we accept your contract. So we're down on page 2 here. And I know I'm going kind of fast, but I want to try to get through all of this in our time, a lot of time today. And I'm happy to send you this stuff, as I always am. If you just send me an email and say, I'd like the FAR bar neighbor comparison charts. Again, this is designed to, if you print this and you put it on a front to back sheet, it's designed to be a handy quick reference to each of the major terms in the contract. So let's talk a little bit about force majeure. Force majeure is a defined term in the FAR and CRISP contracts, and it's actually defines what a force majeure is. You know, it's an act of nature, and goes on and on to decide what the definition of force majeure is, and either party can cancel if more than 30 days it passes with damage to the residents or the common elements. So it's actually in the HOA condo addenda that force majeure is a factor in FAR contracts. We did a lot of soul searching after our friend Irma, and decided that the lawyers were very helpful. They decided that force majeure becomes another kind of open door for somebody to be watching a hurricane on TV and have it go through the town where they're getting ready to buy, and they invoke force majeure, say, no, I'm not coming down there. I don't want to be in that mess. I'm out. In the NABOR contract, we define catastrophic conditions that can occur to a residence, and we allow the buyer a second inspection if they've already done their first inspection, to make sure that the property's in sellable condition, that the seller's maintenance obligation is still intact. And we decided, since Irma was in the residential neighborhoods, was mainly a foliage event, what happens to that 20-foot oak tree in the middle of the circular driveway that got blown over by Irma? Can't go find a 20-foot oak tree. So there's a thing that the lawyers tell me called the Doctrine of Impossibility. And it's the reason we didn't go with force majeure, because the Doctrine of Impossibility says there's no way, no possible way I could ever replace that 20-foot oak tree. But I can replace it with a nice size oak tree, maybe 6, 8, 10 feet, that'll grow to 20 feet. And that's what I'm required to do under the contract, up to 1% of the selling price. So since we lost a lot of landscaping in Irma, 1% of the selling price appeared to be a good barometer of what it would cost to restore the landscaping on a home, right? The seller is not responsible for damage to common elements in a condominium or an HOA, since that is the purview of the HOA. So force majeure is kind of a complicated topic. You really probably need to go again with the details here. We send you right to the line where force majeure is defined, so you can understand it, why it's works a little differently in the FAR contract. The coastal construction control line, not a biggie, but there is a line that goes all the way down the coast that's inland of the water's edge, and it kind of varies, but it goes right down through like Gulf Shore Boulevard and all that. And it's a line that inside of that line, chances are you've got a very high rated flood district, and you've got the possibility of catastrophic damage from a storm surge or flooding. So if your home is inside of the coastal construction control line in NABOR, we require that to be disclosed. In FAR, there is a CR6 addendum that talks about an affidavit or a survey that shows the coastal construction control line. So it works a little differently, but if you're inside of the coastal construction control line, you need to include that CR6 rider, and the CRISP looks at it a little bit differently. An affidavit or survey is required for the buyer unless otherwise waived by the buyer. Assessments, again, assessments work differently. They can be an assessment with an HOA or a condo, and the contracts work a little differently. Basically the assessments in the community development districts are prorated, and there's a checkbox in there that says the seller will pay everything up to closing, the buyer will pay everything after. In the neighbor contract, basically, the buyer assumes the entire CDD balance automatically, and the seller pays for every known assessment that's on the books prior to the effective date of the contract. Anything after that is the buyer's obligation. Again, you have a checkbox in both the FAR/BAR contracts that says seller will pay everything up to closing, buyer will pay everything after. It's not automatically that way in the neighbor contract. Basically, the seller is obligated to pay all existing assessments in full at closing, unless otherwise negotiated. And if you take a look at some of our golf communities, where they have multiple assessments to to redo the golf course, maybe to add pickleball courts, workout room, clubhouse improvements, you can have 4 or 5 ongoing assessments that are spread out over 36 months. And if those assessments are only a few months old and you don't otherwise negotiate it with your buyer, that the buyer is going to assume these installments at closing, the seller could end up with a big surprise. By the way, these 36 payments are accelerated. You've got to pay them off before you can close. And I had that happen in a major golf community where we represented the buyer, and the closing statement came out and the seller went into the 3rd orbit around the moon looking at all the money that he had to pay. And I was like, hey, we didn't negotiate it. The contract says you'll pay it, so ante up. So if you're in a community where there's multiple assessments like this and you're representing the seller, it's a great idea to have that discussion with them, because the seller may say, look, as a condition of this contract, the buyer is going to pay these installments after closing. And it can be negotiated. It's to the buyer's benefit many times, and it could be negotiated in terms of the final price and terms of the contract. All right. Know your assessments, know when they occur, always contact the management company or the association office. First of all, you're going to get a seller's package if you're representing the buyer. That's going to have the application to the condo association. It's going to have the rules and regs. It's going to have, if it's a condo, the Q&A. It'll have current financial statements. So getting that package is very important. Sometimes a crack listing agent will have all that uploaded for you, and all you have to do is download it, give it to the buyer. But many times it's not there. You want to call the association office, find out what's going on, ask them if there's been any discussions about any assessments, and if anything is imminent, or if anything is just passed that you need to know about prior to the effective date of the contract. So always make that call so you yourself, as a buyer's representative, know what your buyer is getting into. And all of this upfront work will solidify your relationship with your customer and make it highly likely that they will like you and trust you and use you again, which is why we're in this business, right? This is our 401k. I do a good job. I help the customer. The customer says, that's great. He tells Brian, and this is the best real estate agent I've ever had. Brian says, oh, I'm looking for one. So there you go. That's how it works. And, if you don't do a good job, are they likely to use you again? Are they likely to tell your friends about it? No. And oftentimes it just takes a little extra effort to get out front on some of these things, and your customer will appreciate it. Okay, so the financing contingency, last week, we did the flow charts. So you know that they're like night and day. And basically the neighbor contract is a contingency until waived by the buyer. Defaults to 45 days, but it can be really, I think if you're the listing agent, you need to make sure you give the seller ample time when that buyer has to waive or make a decision, so that the seller can make arrangements to move or whatever they need to do. And a lot of times that 45 days will be very close to the closing date. And that's not good that's not good at all. It's great for the buyer. I've seen contracts where the financing contingency date was after the closing date. What does that mean? That means the buyer can cancel at any time by saying, here's my letter, I can't get my loan. Or I just lost my job last week, I'm out. But that financing contingency date, I think is really important to make sure if you're representing the seller that you get an actual date there where the buyer's got to say, hey, I have my loan, I'm making my deposits firm, let's move forward. Or the seller can cancel. So in this market, a lot of times the situation is that the buyer's kind of floating along and not saying much, the agent's not saying much, the listing agent, all of a sudden, here comes the financing contingency date, and the seller says, I don't have any confidence these people are going to get their loan at all. Let's cancel and go back on the market. And believe me, that's a sad day for your buyer if you haven't warned them of that possibility, and if they aren't, doing everything they can to communicate with the seller to make sure the seller knows they're working on it, they know they want the property. But when you come upon that date, you need to waive it or extend it if the seller will let you extend it, or you could lose the property. The NABOR contract requires that a uniform credit denial letter, which is a federal document, is provided from the lender. You can't just send an email or a note over saying sorry. You have to have a documented denial letter from the lender. FAR-BAR, new FAR-BAR basically is the loan approval period's 30 days unless changed, and the loan approval includes the appraisal this time. Before in FAR-BAR, you could get loan approval, go floating along, and then all of a sudden, oops, it didn't appraise, and the buyer could get out. Now the buyer cannot get out past 30 days based on an appraisal. The seller has this little window at the end of the loan approval date. If they don't hear from the buyer, they have 3 days to cancel. Buyer gets their money back. But if there is no communication, or if the buyer sends over a notice that my loan's approved, everything proceeds forward and the buyer's deposits are firm. Remember, in the FAR-BAR contract, all deposits are at risk at day one. We'll talk about that in a couple minutes. But in the NABOR contract, it's only deposits made to date. Okay. So these loan approval periods work differently. They have different calendaring requirements, and you just need to know what they are and stay out ahead of them. Make sure your customer knows how the contract works. In the FAR-BAR contract, written notice, an email, hand delivered or overnight mail delivered notice is all that's required. You do not have to have a specific form from the lender saying your loan was denied. You're just notifying the other side, I didn't get my loan, I'm moving on, I want my money back, or I did get my loan, we're moving forward. And once you notify the seller that you got your loan and you're moving forward, that eliminates the seller's ability to cancel. The transaction moves forward, all deposits are firm, and the seller doesn't have that little 3-day window. CRISP works a little differently. There's a commitment period where the buyer's deposit becomes firm, but the appraisal does allow the buyer to get out, kind of like the old FAR. Title insurance works differently in all of these contracts. In the NABOR contract in Collier County, buyer picks, buyer pays. In Lee County, buyer picks, seller pays. In Charlotte County, buyer picks, seller pays. So those are the 3 main areas that the NABOR contract is used in. And in the FAR-BAR, there is a checkbox. Seller picks closer and pays title, or buyer picks closer and pays title. It's a simple checkbox, pick one. All right. So let's talk about the default conditions. And the default conditions occur when a time of the essence date is not adhered to. The NABOR contract's pretty easy. You didn't close when you said you closed. The buyer didn't have their funds. Occasionally we see a seller say, I've changed my mind, I'm not going to sell. That puts the seller in default, and the seller can be sued for specific performance or damages. And we've had maybe half a dozen cases like this year where the seller just said, I changed my mind, I'm not going to sell, and the judge said, I just changed your mind, Mr. Seller, you're going to sell. You signed this contract. This is your obligation. Give me the keys. So, and we had a lady change the locks and try to disappear. Finally got caught by the judge, who said, sorry, you can't do that. So really, most of the case, it's seller's remorse. We had a case where the buyer was transferring out of town and the transfer didn't occur. So now the buyer said, or the seller said, I've decided not to sell. Yeah, the seller ended up selling. So there you go. In the FAR bar contracts, they do require mediation and arbitration as a mandatory dispute resolution. There is no mandatory dispute resolution in the NABOR contract. The seller is entitled to the retain of deposits paid only. In the FAR bar contract, the seller is entitled to all the deposits, whether they've been paid or not. And there is mandatory dispute resolution, meaning they have to go to mediation and arbitration to try to resolve it. We've had a real increase in the number of situations where there's a $10,000 deposit and the seller won't sign off for release. Might have been something as simple as an as-is contract. Might have been the buyer has every right to cancel. They didn't get their loan. And the seller says, I took my place off the market. I want some of that deposit. So what happens there? The contract terminates. The seller can go back on the market, but now there's a deposit dispute. And we had, I don't know whether we have these Ask the Attorney panels 3 or 4 times a year, and I was moderating. And one of the attorneys was asked, who's a trial attorney, what do you think the amount is of a deposit where the buyer really can afford to hire an attorney, pay all the costs? And he said $100,000. Now that may be a little extreme, but if you have a $5,000 or $10,000 deposit, by the time you pay a litigating attorney to take your case, you might want to just split it up or come up with some settlement, because it's time and money. The title agency does have the right to file what's called an interpleader if the dispute isn't resolved in 60 to 90 days. That means the judge awards the title company all of their fees out of the deposit and makes a determination of who gets what, and less attorney's fees. So if you have a $10,000 deposit and it gets an interpleader, you're not getting any money back. Maybe you'll get $1,000 back. So make sure that you have a good relationship between the agents, that you try not to, pull a last minute shocker on the seller, and the seller say, wait a minute, I have my place off the market for 45 days. And now you're just telling me at day 45 that you can't get your loan. I'm not signing off on that deposit. I want part of that deposit. And in many cases, it's negotiated and the seller does get part of the deposit. So be aware of that. Be aware that it's not automatic. Now, if you're closing with an attorney who has their own escrow, they maintain their own escrow account. Many times the attorney, if he sees a clear-cut reason why the seller should get their money back, like an as-is contract, they'll give the money back. But title companies are a little more regulated, and they will not generally release funds without both signatures. So be aware of that. It can be an unpleasant situation, because the seller doesn't sign, title company doesn't release the money, stalemate, but the contract's terminated, so the seller's free to go back out and sell their house. So unless your buyer is of the opinion that I'm going to hire an attorney and spend, advance that attorney several $1,000s to file a lawsuit, it's an expensive process. It can take, how the courts are, it could take several months. If it's less than $7,500, small claims court could be used by the buyer to get their money back. Again, that's not something you want to get involved in advising the buyer what their course of action should be. You could certainly give them the option of several attorneys and let them talk with an attorney. Usually they'll entertain a conversation without requiring any money. But once they decide to move forward to get their deposit back, money will have to be paid to the attorney to seek return of the deposit. So I'm at the bottom of the page. I did it in 55 minutes, which is pretty good stuff. I'll be happy to send these to you. Just email me. I'll just return they're 2 Excel spreadsheets. One's a summary, printed out front and back. It's a easy reference sheet. And the detail sheet will take you for each one of these paragraphs right to the line number in the contract that we're referring to. That's a reference to that amount. So hopefully these will help you, especially if you work in both worlds. This is always one of the best attended classes we have at NABORD. Usually Kevin and Lotus and I do this, and everybody seems to like it. So I'm sharing it with you, and I'm going to sign off. I got to go to my appointment, and I don't know, Mark, did you want to stay on and do any kind of discussion work or Q&A? You're muted, sir.
Let's hold off till next week unless somebody wants to call me, because I've got an appointment also.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Sorry about the short time, but I picked a topic that I thought we could get through. I didn't want to leave you hanging. So
Thank you, Jeff.
everybody have a nice afternoon. Again, if you like these, just let me know. Okay.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
All righty. Everybody take
Thank
care.
you.
Thanks a lot.
Sir, bye-bye.